Hello, and you are listening to Bill Murphy's Red Zone podcast. I interview leaders who inspire me in the areas of exponential technologies, business innovation, entrepreneurship, thought leadership, enterprise IT security, neuroscience, philosophy, personal development, and more. Welcome to the show. Welcome back to the show, everyone. This is Bill Murphy, your host of the Red Zone podcast. It's middle evening on Friday here, and I'm in the Poconos of Pennsylvania getting ready to race tomorrow morning at 7:30. I'm on the starting line to race down a mountain in a Spartan race, an obstacle course Spartan race that I've done several times. It's my big challenge of the year. But the irony is that I have on today a guest who's an expert in ancient Greece. His name is Paul Rahe, historian Paul Rahe. And Paul has a trilogy of books. His third book on Sparta and on the Spartans is being released in a couple weeks. And you'll find it on the show notes page. You can get access to the three main books, which I've read that are fantastic. And I'm endlessly fascinated with Spartans for a couple reasons. Well, I've always been fascinated with the samurai, the Comanche, the Mongols, the knights, and I love these classic cultures. And I think it's because of there's a heroic myth. There's something that always calls, there's a heroic part of all of us that's symbolized by these cultures. So the Spartans stand out for this. And I really wanted to get into, what is history? What does a true historian say about Sparta and about Spartans? And what is the research that's been going on? Why has this persisted? Why has the legends of the Spartans persisted for 1,500 years? And what can we learn? What can we learn from them? What can we learn from them as people? What can we learn from them as a culture? We're 250 or so years in to this great American experiment, and the Spartans lasted about 400 years. So what made them so dominant, and then why did they fail? So we talk about the discomfort that they forced their boys and raised their boys in these very, very interesting way. They raised boys to become men that were these incredibly fearsome leaders of the world, and why Spartans failed. The innovation that Spartans were known for, ultimately they were innovated around, especially on the battlefield. So we're going to talk about the strengths of the Spartans. We're going to talk about actually how they fought in certain formations and such. And we're in a nuclear age now, but how did they fight? Differently in the Civil War, differently in World War I and II, and differently in the classic ages as well. So Paul and I discussed that. And I find it interesting talking to scholars about their deep interest, because I think there's lessons that we can all learn as leaders when we take a step back and peer into the past. There are lessons there that we can learn. So I'm very excited about this. It's very appropriate for me, and I know you're going to find this very, very interesting. With that, I want to introduce you to my great conversation with historian Paul Rahe. All right, Paul. Well, I want to welcome you to the show today.
Pleasure to be with you.
Well, we have been connected through a podcast I listened to, and your book, The Spartan Regime, its character, origins, and grand strategy. And I know that you are also releasing a new book in August. And what's the title of that book going to be?
The new book is called Sparta's First Attic War, The Grand Strategy of Classical Sparta 478 to 446 BC. There was another book in between Spartan Regime and Sparta's First Attic War called The Grand Strategy of Classical Sparta, the Persian Challenge, focused on the Persian Wars. So what this third book is focused on is the period between the Persian Wars and the onset of what we think of as the Peloponnesian War. But of course, what the Spartans and the other Peloponnesians would have thought of as, and did think of, as the Attic War.
Now, for my listeners, just what I want to do is visually sort of tee them up for what we're going to talk about today. and the area of the world we're going to talk about so that everybody sort of can understand where we are and where we are in history, and we can build from there. So we're basically talking about the Mediterranean regions, really ancient Greece, correct?
Yes, in the Eastern Mediterranean in particular. So the islands between Turkey and the Balkan Peninsula, and then the Greek cities on the mainland within the Balkan Peninsula.
Now, the Spartans that we're talking about, I actually was interesting. I was reading, sort of perusing some of the back parts of your book as I was concluding, and there was a mention to World War II, to Paddy, and to resistance fighters from World War II that resisted Hitler in this area. Was this directly in Crete, this resistance, or you had spent some time in the mountains in the areas around this area? Was that the mountains that essentially were right through the middle of Sparta?
Okay. The man I was speaking with was Patrick Lee Firmer, who had captured the German commander on Crete during World War II and had spirited him off to Cairo. He worked underground, dressed as a shepherd up in the mountains in Crete. But there was resistance also within the Peloponnesus. And Paddy's home, he died just a few years ago, Paddy's home was in Kardamyle in the Mani in the southern Peloponnesus, in the area that the Spartans controlled in the classical period. So I went to meet him because I figured he knew something about resistance in that region. And I was concerned with the fact that certain kinds of geography, and I mean mountainous areas, are conducive to banditry, but also to resistance of an occupation. And in Messenia, which the Spartans occupied, there are mountains, and it was my conviction, still is my conviction, that there were runaway helots. These would be the subordinate population within the Spartan domain, hiding out in those mountains and raiding the fertile land down below in the river valley.
I'm really looking forward to asking you questions about that. It was really interesting reading that because I had read a book recently by Chris McDougall, who wrote a book called The Natural Born Heroes, and it was about the resistance fighters in these Greek islands. And so it just kind of collided with me. He is actually the founder of the barefoot running movement as well from his book. So this mountainous area, so talking more about Sparta. So Sparta had this mountainous region right through the middle. Was it Tyrese? What was
Tygatos.
Tygatos.
Yeah. Look, Sparta's in a river valley, the Eurotas River Valley. Messenia, where the bulk of Sparta's helots who do the farming for them, they live in the Pamisos River Valley. In between those two river valleys is the Tygatos Massif. It's a mountain range, really, rather than just simply a mountain. So one of the strategic problems that the Spartans have is to control both areas. They have to be able to travel easily from one river valley over the mountains or around the mountains to the other river valley. It's a real challenge, and they managed it. Their dominion in both the southwestern and southeastern Peloponnesus is almost contrary to nature because of that mountain range that lies between the two regions within the southern Peloponnesus.
Well, it's fascinating. The actual, I think I mentioned to you when we were talking before jumping on the air here, is that I participate with a group of local friends of mine in Spartan Races, which is essentially an obstacle course race run anywhere between 3 to 20 miles. And the irony is it's in a mountain. And so there's 4 major mountain races, and there's a variety of others that are not in mountains. But it was super interesting to read about this mountain divide between the two, Messenia and Laconia, that you had just referred to.
Yeah, the Spartans would have had to march over those mountains at a pretty fast pace. So they really had to be in shape.
So I'm really interested in dispelling myths and how was Sparta founded? And there's a whole cultural myth and legend around Sparta and Spartans. What is the genesis that you think from your research of when Sparta, if there was such a thing, is founded? And then maybe we could talk about the culture and what is true about their culture and what is sort of a myth.
Yeah, okay. The Spartans, the story they tell about their founding is they came from northern Greece, from the other side of the Corinthian Gulf, which separates the Peloponnesus from northern Greece, and that they crossed the Corinthian Gulf on rafts and then made their way, along with other Dorians, into Messenia, the Argolid, and Laconia, which is to say where Sparta was. I see no reason why the myth should not be true. What we do know, and we have more solid information on, is archaeologically, we begin to see a set of villages in Laconia in the 9th century BC. There's reason to think that they coalesce into a single political community between the 9th century BC and the 8th century BC, and come to dominate the whole river valley from top to bottom and the mountainous areas nearby, both the eastern slopes of Mount Taygetos and the other mountains that lie between them and the sea. At the end of the 8th century, they then apparently, again, this is according to their own story, but we have some material, literary material, that goes back to a period maybe 60 years later. They launch a war to conquer the Pamisos River Valley in Messenia on the other side of the mountain, and they succeed. There is then a rebellion 2 generations later, and we have poetry from that time of rebellion, referring back to the first conquest of Messenia, but also celebrating the reconquest of Messenia. All right, in the course of taking on this challenge of controlling these 2 river valleys, the Spartans articulate a way of life, and also they articulate a political constitution that is the ancestor of our own political constitution. That is to say, it involves a division of powers. In the Spartan case, between 2 kings who function as priests and as generals, but also as leaders. A gerousia, something like a senate, which is, say, a council of elders, probably drawn from the aristocratic classes. An assembly that includes every citizen, and a body of figures called ephors, which means supervisors. And they seem to be elected to 1-year terms. And there's good reason to think that they're elected in such a way that most of the ephors are commoners, there being 5 of those. And so the community is run by a balance between these different groups. And what it means is they can't do much of anything unless there's a consensus. And that makes sense because the one thing that could lead to their being in deep, deep trouble vis-a-vis this Helot class, which outnumbers them maybe 7-1, maybe 5-1, maybe 4-1 people. The ancient evidence says 7-1. Some people think that's impossible. But what we do know is they are badly outnumbered, and that the Helots in Messenia on the other side of the mountains have a sense of themselves as being members of a political community. So the Helots are a kind of nation in bondage and very apt to rebel. If you want to keep control of those Helots, the one thing you absolutely need is solidarity among the master class. And this elaborate constitutional framework that they articulate guarantees that any decision that gets made will have been thoroughly aired and that pretty much everyone is on board with it, even those who were initially dubious about the wisdom of it.
So the Helots, and this clarifies something for me as I was reading, the Helots were under this framework. This framework of political infrastructure was not just for the Spartans, but it was for the subjugated class as well. Yes. Now, they don't have a vote. Okay. They're part of it in the sense that they live within the territory. They have certain residual rights to a part of what they grow. They have families and so forth. But they don't play any role in the larger decision-making. And they are very much a subjugated class, an exploited class. And that
brute fact means that the Spartans have to organize their lives around maintaining their control over these people. And so their lives are military, not in the sense that they often go to war. In fact, they tend to try to avoid war, but that they are always preparing for war. So what you have to think about is Spartan life is the life of an armed camp. And that sounds grim, but in fact, it's less grim than you might think. There's lots of sports.
Yeah,
there's lots of hunting.
It seems like you said that there was, which we really got from your book, is that it seemed to be they were. This is where it's kind of like it's a huge dichotomy. It's almost hard to read in some respects because you expect this warrior class to just be all about war, but then there was dance and there's music and poetry and sports and gymnastics. Like, how did they reconcile that? Was it just this upper class of men that were just basically living, both preparing for war and also having fun at the same time?
Yes. Look, think of it at certain times of the year. There are baseball camps for Major League Baseball teams, usually in warm weather places like Florida, as they're preparing for the season to come on. Now, they work hard every day. They run, they exercise in a great variety of ways. They pitch, they bat, they work on their skills. To suppose that they're not enjoying themselves would be a big mistake. Yes, it's physically very demanding, but people thrill to that.
And then you also mentioned that there was an egalitarian, maybe that's the wrong word, but there was almost like a socialist framework that nobody could keep symbols of wealth unless maybe it was horse racing, but you weren't able to like acquire land and kind of build up your empire within the. Maybe you could explain that, because that seems very interesting how these warriors, you think they'd want to come out like the Vikings and sort of bring home the loot, but I didn't get that sense from your book that they were wired that way.
It's very communal. The men have their meals together until probably the age of 45. They spend their nights sleeping in a kind of encampment with the squad. If they see their wives, they do it surreptitiously in the middle of the night. So everything really is focused on the relations between men in a 15-man group called a Syssitia, which is about the size of a squad in the United States Army. And everything is about camaraderie and rivalry of a friendly sort between these men. And the rivalry takes the form of sports, but also the competition in marching, counter-marching, and all the things that soldiers do. I once wrote a blog post about West Point. I'd given a talk at West Point, and I called it Sparta on the Hudson. And it really is something like that. They all have their meals together. They live in dormitories. They are on sports teams. They're always working out, and they're studying hard.
Now, they're also, to become a part of this, I guess, I don't want to call it a fraternity, but become a part of this squad or become a part of this elite group, you were taken from your mother at 7 or 8 years old, correct?
Yeah, you're taken away from your mother at 7 years old. And then you are put through a kind of educational system they call the agoge. And there's stages in it. And it shifts almost the way we shift from Cub Scouts to Boy Scouts to explorers. Perhaps because the Boy Scouts were really modeled on ancient Sparta. Certainly Baden-Powell was aware of ancient Sparta. So the idea is to build trust and camaraderie within age classes that advance together to more and more demanding challenges of mainly a physical sort, but not just a physical sort. And so they're trained in this elaborate way. And at a certain stage, probably when they're about 18, they have to go off individually. And they live in the mountains, and they have to steal food. And they may be used to police the helots that are runaways in the mountains. And after this year of withdrawal from the community, they come back. And those who have succeeded are initiated into one of these squads, these Syssidia. And it's very much like a fraternity in the sense that you cannot join a Syssidia unless everybody consents to it. And every single member of the Syssidia has what you might call a blackball and can say, no, we will not take this person. And obviously what they're looking for is somebody to fight next to them in the battle line, somebody they can trust with their own lives. And then you spend the next 27 years pretty much living with the people in your Syssidia.
Now, on the Agoge, before you get to the Syssidia level, why did they try? So the Helots were this subjugated kind of class of slaves, and then when you went into the Agoge, I was reading the kids, the young boys were essentially not treated very well. Like it seemed like that they were deprived of food. They were essentially challenged continually, and they almost lived like a helot. It seemed like they lived like a subjugated servant. Why did the Spartans want them to be that low to the ground, and that? Why did they want them to be that? To get that feeling?
Your way of putting it, I think, is very well. They want them to experience something like the life of the Helots so that they know what would be in store for them if they were to fail in battle. So you give them a sense of the value of liberty by exposing them to something very much like slavery.
So that discomfort, they really valued that just because it's so counterintuitive in some respects, because by exposing to that discomfort, they're also the Syssidia is dancing and they're poetry and they're sort of living this expanded life, but they actually deeply know almost a poverty, abject experience, and that's very interesting.
Well, think what boot camp is like for a would-be United States Marine. It's very similar. You have somebody yelling at you, cursing you. You get put through your paces. You get pushed to your limits. And what they're trying to do is twofold. Build up your strength and your abilities and your skills, but also build up your pride. The fact that you can endure. And look, endurance is very important for the kind of warfare that the Spartans and all the other Greeks engage in, at least on land, which is to say hoplite warfare. You have to think of it as something like an ongoing rugby scrum. You have a group of men lined up 8 deep. Each man bears a shield. There's a hook in the middle of the shield. He puts his arm through it. There's another hook on the right side of the shield. It's his right, and he lays hold of that. His shield covers his left side, and it covers the right side of the man next to him. So the shield is almost useless for individual fighting. It's very good, however, for fighting in a phalanx. And so what you have is a clash of people with these shields against other people with these shields. And in the right hand of each man is a spear. And if he loses it, he can resort to a sword that he has by his side. And there's pushing and shoving and stabbing that is part of this warfare. So what's required to win? Staying power, endurance. That's what these young Spartans learn. They learn to put up with pain, with discomfort, and they gain in the kind of physical strength to stand their ground and shove their way through.
Okay. So that's what I was going to ask, is that how do you actually kill someone if they're just matched up against shield, but basically they're just trying to thrust the spears in between the gaps or
over the top.
Over the top.
Yeah,
okay.
and the two places where a hoplite is most vulnerable, the neck and the groin, because it's very hard to. They may wear a breastplate, but that will not protect your neck and it won't protect your groin. They may wear a helmet. It may protect the head by and large, but not the neck. They may wear greaves on their legs, but they don't protect the groin. So it's either over the top with the spear or under or around the shield with a sword. It's a rough way to die.
Yeah, okay. And basically in this warfare, in this era, was it in these groups of squads of 8 deep? How many wide were they in a general when they were from like a battle formation?
It depends on the terrain, and of course it depends on how many of them there are. They cannot spread out because they need to be close to one another so the shields interlock.
Okay.
If the shields aren't interlocking, it's useless. But the question you put points to something important. Numbers matter. You really have to have a large community. And so this particular style of warfare, which comes in the late 8th and early 7th centuries, requires a measure of democracy. So these Spartans, to come back to this question of equality that you raised earlier, they're called the equals or the peers. And I think peers may be the better word because they are a lordly lot. But among themselves, they're all for putting down inequality, except for one inequality, the inequality that some are stronger than others. So they compete for excellence of a certain kind. But they don't compete in the sense of keeping up with the Joneses, having the fanciest new car, having jewelry, having the beautiful clothing. So at one level, what you have is a kind of socially enforced equality in which you don't want to stand out because you're one of the peers. In another way, you have sharp inequalities because some people have more prowess than others. So they're highly competitive in certain areas and uncompetitive in other areas.
Yeah, it seems like that would be a way to kind of mitigate that otherwise natural urge to want to compete in other domains with wealth or status or who has the most horses or whatever it may be back then that was meaningful.
Right. And, they do have horses. And one of the rules is you can take anybody's horse and ride it. So though there are differences in wealth, and some people have, horses are the Porsches of the time because they're expensive to sustain, there is a sharing of them. There's a sharing of hunting dogs. There's a kind of communal feeling. The other thing is there's very little privacy because you live together. And it's a small community, never more than, say, 10,000. At the time of the Persian Wars, 8,000. So everybody knows everything about everyone. And if you've made a fool of yourself at some point in your life, everyone will remember it. It's tremendous social pressure to perform.
Yeah, that seems like it's a competitive cauldron. And there's been some American Indian cultures the same way. I mean,
yes.
And even American Indians where they send their warriors out for their, I don't know what they call it necessarily. I'm not an expert, but like their spirit quest, or they go out alone and they have to, it seems similar to what the Greeks did with the Spartan way from the Agoge experience. And you said that they sent them out into the mountains for a year back to the Agoge when they're 18, which is really interesting because my son is 16. And so they would send the boys, men out at 18 into the mountains. And from your book, it said the Helots, some of the Helots were, so essentially the rogue Helots were in the mountains. And they sent the Spartan boys out with knives for a year. I'd like you to confirm that and just like what actually was the experience like, and how do you learn that? Is it from oral tradition? Like who's actually recording these facts that someone like a historian like you would know how to interpret that to come up with those?
It comes from a variety of sources. One of them is Herodotus, who writes a bit about the Spartans because they were involved in the Persian Wars. Thucydides writes about them because they were involved, obviously, in the Great War between Athens and the Peloponnesians. In the 4th century, after the Spartans defeat the Athenians, they set up an empire. And the consequence of that is, though they had been secretive in the past, they're not really capable of being secretive anymore. And there are a whole series of figures who get to know Sparta rather well, including 2 students of Socrates, Critias, who writes a treatise on Sparta that we only have snippets of, Xenophon, who writes a treatise that we have in its entirety, but also later figures, younger than these two. Plato, another student of Socrates, writes about them both in his Republic and in his Laws. And Aristotle wrote a constitution of the Lacedaemonians. The Sparta is called Lacedaemon, just as he wrote a constitution of the Athenians. We have Aristotle's constitution of the Athenians. We don't have his constitution of the Spartans, or regime of the Spartans might be a better translation. But figures like Plutarch did have that, and they drew heavily on it. So we have material from Herodotus, Thucydides, Xenophon, Plutarch, and we have snatches of material from other figures who read these writings about Sparta. And what they have to tell us fits together pretty well. Now, this business of going off for a year is called the Krypteia. You've probably heard of kryptonite if you've ever seen a Superman movie. Well, the root word means secret.
Okay.
So this is a kind of secret service in which they go undercover, so to speak, for a year. And they live something like Helots rather than like Spartians. And in many cultures, there are rites of passage when you go from one condition to another condition. We have rites of passage, baptism. We have marriages. You go from being unmarried to being married. We have funerals. You go from living to dead. They had rites of passage that were connected with coming of age. Some Christian churches have confirmation. There are various ceremonies within Judaism that are similar to this. There are ceremonies within Islam as well that have to do with coming of age. So the Spartans have this in a fairly elaborate way, and there are stages. And these stages involve tests that you have to pass in order to move on to the higher ranks. We have graduations. 8th grade graduations, high school graduations, right. College graduations. I'm a parent. I have to go to these things. They're awful.
I agree with that. 8th grade, I don't understand. What do we accomplish here?
Yes, right. It's just, oh, God. But anyway.
So clearly, sending them away into the mountains was a significant test for a year in they're living like the Helots. You often quote in the book some philosophers from the 16th and 1700s, Montesquieu and Rousseau, and you actually started the book out, and I think it's just really fascinating, and I'd like to see why you did that. Here's the quote from Rousseau. This is clearly about the Spartans and the Lacedaemonians. The crimes inspire in us horror. Sometimes their virtues themselves make us shiver, because we are weak and pusillanimous in good times and in bad. Everything that bears a certain character of force and vigor seems to us impossible. The incredulity that we parade is the work of our cowardice rather than that of our reason. And that was from Rousseau. And you started the book out that way. Can you give me some where you were going with that? Because that's really powerful.
Well, an awful lot of the scholarship on Sparta in the 20th century and stretching into the 21st century has been guilty of incredulity, a simple refusal to believe what the ancient sources tell us about Sparta. So in the 30s, there was a book written by a French scholar called Le Mirage Spartiate, the Spartan Mirage. I don't believe there was much of a Spartan mirage. I think the problem is exactly what Rousseau identified in the 18th century, which is we live comfortable bourgeois lives, and we just can't believe that these people were as tough and as disciplined and as dedicated as they obviously were. Now, another reason I use the passage from Rousseau is this. In the 19th century and in the 20th century and into the 21st century, there's a great fascination with Athens. And there is a propensity for us to imagine that the Athenians were just like us. And so we look to Athens as a kind of model for democracy. Prior to the French Revolution, no one figure I can think of as an exception to this, Marchemont Needham, looked to Athens as a model. They looked to Sparta and they looked to Rome.
Okay.
So Rousseau is in some ways typical. I could have extracted a very similar statement from a figure in the Scottish Enlightenment named Adam Ferguson, who wrote a book on the history of civil society. And Adam Ferguson was familiar with the Highlanders in Scotland. And you can, when you read him talking about Sparta, you can see that he's really talking about the Highlanders, who lived a life not unlike that of the Spartans.
Yeah, I think there's a shocking part to it because we grew up, tend to be soft in the Western world. And it's unbelievable to think that you would take the children away at 7. But what's really interesting, I think you mentioned it in the book, but if you didn't, I know maybe you can confirm this story or not, but the mothers, when they were reintroduced to the mothers, was that relationship gone forever, or was because the stories I've heard is that the mothers would say, listen, go out to battle and win the battle and either come back with their swords and their shields, or you come back with your head on someone else's, or something of that nature. Like, it's
more laconic. The Spartan mother handed the shield to her son, and she says, with it or on it? Okay. With it means you kept your shield, you fought in battle. On it means you're dead. Now, the alternative is you throw it away and you run as fast as you can. Now, you can't run with that shield. It's too bulky and too heavy. They'll catch you. So if you lose in battle, you throw away your shield. And what the Spartan mother says to him is, with it or on it? My view is we have the sayings of the Spartan women. We have a bunch of these that Plutarch records. I think the relationship between mothers and sons is intensified by taking the boy away from the mother. That is to say, there is deep longing on both sides. And you frustrate that longing, you intensify that longing.
Sure.
So there's a kind of irony here that in trying to loosen the relations, they actually tighten the relations.
Now, how, from the clearly abundance of writing on the topic, how tough, and that's not the right question, but how tough were the Spartans? Meaning, if a Spartan were in battle, what was the force multiplier? Like, was one Spartan worth 10 Helot warriors, or was one Spartan the equivalent of 30? And was it clearly the physical presence, or was it their ability to think that made them different? Is there any?
There are 3 different things that make them different. One is physical strength. If you devote yourself to gaining in physical strength, you're likely to be pretty good. The second thing is drill. The other Greeks are amateurs on the battlefield. They're farmers. They are soldiers on the weekend, if there is a weekend. There's not a whole lot of drilling. The Spartans can maneuver. A command can be given, and they can do it. So marching and counter-marching and changing the formation and so forth, they're really very capable of that. So they've got a flexibility that other Greek armies don't have. The third thing is prestige. At some point, the Spartans begin having a lambda for Lacedaemon on their shields. And what it means is if a Spartan army is closing in on you, you know who it is closing in on you. It's the Spartans closing in on you. And one of the things that we see is the other side simply cuts and runs. There's a great battle in 418 BC in Mantinea, which I have written about in a book that's coming out next summer called Sparta's Second Attic War. And at that battle, 2 armies, the Spartans and some of their local allies, the Argives, some Athenians, the Mantineans, they join in battle. The armies are roughly equal in size. The Argives are the great rivals of the Spartans within the Peloponnesus. This is their chance to become the dominant power. They close, and it's the Spartans on one side versus the Argives on the other in that part of the battle line, and the Argives cut and run.
Just ran.
Yeah. So, prestige is a tremendous force multiplier, because if you think you're going to be beaten, the way to try to save your life is to cut and run. So that's one part of it. But the other part of it is endurance. I said something about strength, but it's more than just raw strength. The Spartans don't give up. And of course, the famous example of that is Leonidas and the 300 at Thermopylae, where they fight to the death. If you are a Greek hoplite from some other city, you don't want to fight against people who are going to fight to the death. You want to fight against people who you will clash with, and then they will cut and run. But the Spartans will never cut and run.
So a lot of the people listening are like, okay, Bill, what's this have to do with me today? And I'm endlessly fascinated with warrior cultures. I think I mentioned to you, I love reading about the Spartans, the Mongols, the Comanches, the samurai, and in the context of Spartans, what can we learn from them from a leadership perspective that you think stands out from this class, this culture, this political system, that looking back on this, we can see that in the middle of the United States, we're in a 250-year, 300-year run right now. The Spartans went about 400 years?
Yes, something like that. Yes.
So what can we learn from them, from what their mistakes and their strength and their leadership?
Well, one thing you can learn is survival of a political community depends in some measure on the virtues of the members of that political community. And look, we halfway understand this. If you look around the United States, can you think of a sports team called the Athenians?
No, we can't.
There are Spartans everywhere, not least at Michigan State University. When I dream at night, sometimes I dream of giving a lecture at halftime about the ancient Sparta at a Michigan State University of Michigan football game. This will never happen, I assure you, but it would be fun. But there are Spartans everywhere. And why? Because there are coaches and schools that want their sportsmen, especially their football teams, but basketball teams too, to have that kind of endurance and strength and team spirit that was exemplified by the ancient Spartans. Now, look, sports are a preparation for war. They're in some sense an image of war. The kind of language that coaches use on the eve of a game is warlike language. So for a country to be able to defend itself, it has to be able to put forces in the field that are not unlike the Spartans. And for a country to be very effective, they need to build up the kind of prestige that the Spartans build up. You need to have a reputation. You don't want to take those people on.
Right.
They're really trouble. That's one part of it. Another part of it I think is important is political institutions. One of the reasons that we've been tolerably successful in the United States is we have political institutions designed to provide for deliberation and perhaps produce wisdom, but also designed to produce consensus. So we have a separation of powers between a president, judiciary, the legislature, and within the legislative body, it's divided between the Senate that has a certain character and the House that has another character. All of this slows down decision-making, but when decisions get made, they usually stick. And that's a great advantage, resoluteness.
Sure.
Which can arise from, domestic harmony, promoting domestic harmony. And we're not always so successful at that, but we've done pretty well over the years. And the consequence is that we have a reputation. You don't really want to mess with the Americans.
Well, I love how you've brought this ancient culture to life. I really enjoyed reading the book, and I've also noticed, and you and I talked about this concept between your books, these themes that are building around strategy and grand strategy. And this also has a leadership element to it as well. And a lot of my listeners, we talk about innovation quite a bit, and we talk about the ability to respond and the ability to change one's mind and being mobile, not just with your human body but being agile with your mind. And I'm curious, what did you mean by grand strategy and strategy, and as you roll out these books? And maybe you could talk to us about that.
Okay, strategy is focused on a particular struggle. How are we going to win this struggle in these circumstances? And so it's very much tied up with the passing moment and would be tied up with the technology of the moment, the circumstances in which we find ourselves in now. Grand strategy is something that political communities develop over time, sometimes because they have brilliant leadership, more often by a process of trial and error, in which they learn what it is they need to protect. They come to be governed by a particular political regime that has particular imperatives and that fosters a way of life that they want to protect. And there are certain things that are permanent in conditions. The geography is more or less permanent. So grand strategy looks at a political community in its situation over time, over long periods of time. And it asks what is necessary for this political community to flourish. And it asks what threatens the flourishing of this political community. And so grand strategy involves looking at not just warfare, but looking at the economy, looking at diplomacy, looking at one's rivals and potential enemies and at their character, what they're likely to do. So, if you were a practitioner of grand strategy today, you would want to know what makes Russia tick. What is it that Vladimir Putin is aiming at? What are their resources like? Are they overreaching? Are they much less powerful than they pretend to be? And you'd ask the very same questions about China. What is it they're aiming at? Is that compatible with our flourishing? What sort of resources do they bring to the table? What can we do to limit their capacity to advance their cause in a way that is damaging to us? So you have to know what your own interests are. You have to know what your own concerns are. And then you have to apply the same kind of analysis to other countries of significance, including your allies or your potential allies. What is it they want? How can we keep them on board? So you think in a much larger way. You're not thinking about winning this battle.
Sure.
Or even necessarily this war. You're thinking about flourishing in the long run.
How strong was Rome at this time during clearly Sparta declined and it declined at some point. Was there an event that caused it to decline, or is it just gradually just disappeared because it just got diluted? The culture was diluted in its message and just became a greater part of Rome.
What destroyed Sparta's strength and reduced it to a kind of backwater that was a kind of Disneyland in later times was overreaching. The Spartans of the 7th, 6th, and 5th century, most of it anyway, understood that their culture, their way of life, was a hothouse flower. They understood that they did not have the manpower to create and sustain a great empire. So they practiced a kind of Peloponnesian isolationism. And they sallied forth from the Peloponnesus, this peninsula that's sort of at the bottom of the Balkans, only when they had to, when there was a threat from the outside that was apt to overwhelm them, like the Persians or the Athens with her empire. But when they were done with the war, they returned to their homeland. They didn't seek to become a great imperial power. At the end of the Third Attic War, at the end of what readers of Thucydides often call the Peloponnesian War, in 404 BC, the Spartans changed their grand strategy. Instead of following a policy of isolationism in order to preserve their way of life, they chose an imperial venture. The effect of the imperial venture was that it displayed all of the weaknesses that earlier generations of Spartans had warned against. That is to say, when they went abroad, they lost their sense of discipline because there was nobody in their community watching them. In the absence of surveillance, they went wild. They learned that their manpower was insufficient for the task. And they got themselves into a series of struggles with other powers, including the Boeotians, the Thebans in particular, in which they fought repeated wars with these people and taught them how to fight. And the Thebans worked out a technique on the battlefield that could blow a hole in the battle line of the enemy. Instead of lining up 8 deep, they lined up 25 deep in one corner of the battlefield. And the aim was to knock a hole in the enemy phalanx, pour through that hole, and hit them from behind. So the Spartans didn't keep up, in a certain sense, technologically. The technology of war, under pressure from the Spartans, the Thebans experimented, and they tried something new, and it worked. And so in 371, the Thebans defeat the Spartans, and the Spartans can't really sustain themselves thereafter because of the loss of manpower. And so in the aftermath of this Battle of Leuctra in 371, the Thebans and their Boeotian allies liberate the Messenians from the Spartans. So they lose the economic foundations for their maintaining a way of life that makes them strong and dangerous. This, by the way, is at a time when Rome is still a power in Italy and has not expanded beyond Italy.
Okay, that makes sense. No, that's interesting. So that answers one of my questions about innovation, as far as they didn't quite keep up to the battlefield tactics, and then lost a critical part of their empire, the Messia, to that group. Well, this is great, and I've really enjoyed our conversations, Paul. We'll have to do a round 2 when your book releases here in the next month and a half. Yeah,
very good. I look forward to it. Yeah, it's a pleasure being with you.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay, take care. Bye.
I hope you loved that episode with Paul Rahe on the Spartans and their way of life and leadership. A special note, our sponsor is Red Zone Technologies. Yes, I founded Red Zone over 19 years ago, and we're an IT security company focused on securing the lives of 1 billion people. If you are a IT decision maker and you're interested in cloud kill chain or email kill chain strategies, techniques, and tactics, email cloudkill@redzonetech.net. That's cloudkill@redzonetech.net. And just say, yes, I'm interested in learning more about that. And we can set up a Zoom call to talk to you further about cloud kill chain and email kill chain security strategies, techniques, and tactics. This is Bill Murphy, your host, signing off. Have a great night. So there you have it. This wraps another episode of Bill Murphy's Red Zone podcast. To get all the relevant show notes, please go to our blog at www.redzonetech.net/podcast. Additionally, make sure you go to iTunes and leave your comments in iTunes about the show. This helps our show rankings enormously and it helps support the show. Until next time, I appreciate you very much for listening. Thank you.